Hi there, my name is Nic Watt. I'm a UX designer, and this is part 4 of the series of videos I've done for the RetroArch team to help improve the UX and some of the UI issues that they've historically been facing. I'm not going to go into too much depth in regards to what we found in previous videos, so I suggest you watch them. It's also covered in the slide deck I just shared in the link to the video as well. So today we're going to cover, finally, the suggested changes that I've got in mind. So this is the slide deck that I've made, and as I mentioned already, the goal is to surface some UX improvements that will hopefully improve the usability of the app for both novice users all the way through to developer users. In the previous videos, we've covered personas, metaphors, and user journeys, and they're kind of like getting us a better, more holistic understanding of kind of where the app is and maybe who is using it, etc. And today we're going to cover the suggested changes. So I've spent some time mocking up some proposed changes, which I've shared in the Discord as well for the RetroArch team. These were mocked up primarily in Figma, and they're to illustrate the ideas and proposed changes that I think it would be good to make. And the main goal is to try to not necessarily reduce any of the features or functions of RetroArch per se, but to potentially make it at least initially easier for novices to use, while still allowing all the depth of settings and so forth that experts and developers can access. So just to recap, the aim of this is to improve the UX for the personas that we came up with. Now, as part of the persona video, we talked about how everyone who comes to RetroArch is a gamer. I mean, that's not strictly true. Some people might be coming to set up for DOS, to emulate DOS, for example. But the core people that are coming are to use content within cores, and it's easier summarized as gamers. And they can then be split into like 3 main brackets, which are novices, experts, and obviously the developers who make RetroArch themselves. And so a lot of the discussion we'll be doing on the suggested improvements is to try and, 1, make it easier for novices, but 2, not necessarily annoy experts and developers or remove features or functionality that they're used to or looking for. So we don't want to dumb down the experience necessarily, and hopefully some of my proposals will make sense in that light. The second aim is we came across a bunch of metaphors, and we want to try and find ways to better reinforce these. And obviously, part of the way we split it down is the 5 main metaphors are RetroArch as the app and everything it does, and then the cores and what they do, and then a playlist and what it is, and then a game or a piece of content, and also a controller. Now, controller is probably the one that's kind of least surfaced through the UI and also through the suggested changes. It probably doesn't need too much support, but it's definitely worth highlighting that it is a metaphor that we have. So the first main change that I'd like to propose is that the lighter gray areas, of which are present in RetroArch as it stands, be thought of as RetroArch areas of the app. So you have this long top bar and this long bottom bar. They consistently are RetroArch, right? The bottom one is telling you what to press next or what you can press next to do stuff. And the top bar, until now, has primarily just been a title kind of letting you know where you are in the app. So I'm proposing maintaining that, but making some changes to that. And part of this is the hard reinforcement I'm suggesting of making playlists the entirety of this section of the sidebar. So you can see here this vertical line still means that this is the sidebar, and I've actually expanded the sidebar upwards into this gray area, and that will become a little bit more apparent as to what I mean by that in a minute. Now, this central darker gray area is what I'm kind of loosely calling actions. So when you choose something, for example, a playlist or the main menu, then the list of actions that you can perform will be presented here. And obviously, if you've chosen a playlist, it will be games, right? So already what we're trying to do is we present the user, if we do this, with two very physical areas that reinforce the metaphor. The orange area, obviously it's not going to be orange in the actual app, but just for our purposes, the orange area is the playlist metaphor, and the light grey area is the RetroArch metaphor. And then the actions area will change depending on to reflect the metaphor that's currently chosen, right? So when we move on, what I'm proposing on doing is taking the main menu button out of the visual hierarchy of the playlists or of the sidebar and putting it up here. Now, functionally, under the hood, I feel like it can still think it's part of the sidebar, as it were, and that the sidebar expands up here. But from a visual context, from the user's perspective, it is a different looking button. Now, you still navigate to it in the same way, so maybe it's the default, maybe it is highlighted by default, who knows, right? We can discuss that in more detail. But by pushing up, if you're on a playlist, you'll get to here. If by pushing down, you'll go into, and go through all the playlists. And so it still functionally works the same way as the current sidebar, but the button looks different and is put within the hierarchy that is RetroArch, as it were. And then in this bar here, we have the main menu title, and that will change depending on where you are. So in this example, we've currently selected the main menu button. So this will say main menu, and then, or whatever we decide to call it, and then this will be a list of all the actions that you can perform in that. If you then move down into playlist, this will obviously all change. So this is an example of what this could look like. So instead of calling it the main menu, which I feel is quite confusing to users, because it's the main menu, is everything else a submenu, and then often you've kind of got this weird setup where you've got the main menu with a few options, and then you've got a settings menu with more options, and it's like, what is the difference between these two? So I'm proposing rolling all of that into one and calling it RetroArch. So as I said before on this previous screen, this is still the sidebar. So while we currently have RetroArch highlighted, if I move down, the next thing would be add new playlist. And if I move down, it will go history and so on and so forth, right? And we go back up, I'll go to RetroArch eventually. This here is RetroArch main options. That's the title. I'm not saying we have to change the name of it to that, but that's a proposal. This will change depending on what you've got selected on this sidebar. The second proposal here is to try and create groupings, and this will become apparent further through the app, but you can see I've used them on the left here as well. And this is useful for the user because it now tells us this is the area, hey, this is the area for playlists. And maybe if you're a new user, there might not be much here, right? But this is all about playlists, so that we're now telling them this is what that metaphor is, right? And then these groups we can use over here to much better reinforce the user like what they're related to, right? So if you come up to the RetroArch menu and this opens, right, games and content. Do I want to do something with games and content? Maybe I want to add a new core, right? That's related to games and content. Maybe I want to add or manage playlists. Now, despite the fact we can do it here, we've now got this option here. And the great thing about this is we can then create a submenu where I can then go into the management of playlists, or I can choose to add a new one, right? And maybe we can directly open a particular game or piece of content, and also put NetPlay up here as well, so it's no longer in this sidebar list. And then there's a general bunch of RetroArch settings. So you'll see here, this is like the settings, which is normally sits in the sidebar. That's being moved here. I suggest that, and it's a separate issue I'll maybe go over later, I suggest that the settings also have a pass at being better grouped and organized, just to make it a little bit clearer. I put configuration files here, and then update, I've just renamed that, right? Rather than running online updater, I think it's fairly apparent that you're going to go online to update, so we can just call it update. And I've removed out of there the add or manage cores, because I feel like the user is going to want to come to that when they're thinking about games and content. And then the first thing that they're going to think about is not, oh, I need to go to update be able to add or manage my cores, right? That's not an obvious user action in my opinion. And then below that, we can have a bunch of general things like restart, quit, and so on and so forth. It's also worth mentioning that I think something that would really benefit developers in particular is the ability in developer builds to set a flag against any settings menu item and mark it, as it were, in development. And what I think that should do if you set that flag is that in a development build, there'll be a new group here, potentially at the top of this list, that says developer. And below that, let's say you're currently debugging some menu drivers, or I don't know, some deeply nested setting. If you set that developer flag, it will just get the developer group will appear, and that menu option, that setting that you're adjusting, will appear here. So you can just immediately go RetroArch into this developer group, and then you can click on that, and that will take you straight to that setting. But for when you do a release build for end users, it will ignore those flags, and that won't appear, right? And obviously on another developer's build, your ones won't appear either. That should be saved locally, in my opinion. So it means that developer A can have a developer field here with a whole bunch of stuff, and developer B can have a developer field there with completely different ones, right? And that way, the UI stops being massaged, because I think one of the problems that the UI is facing at the moment is a bunch of settings are put to the top because developers are constantly going into them, and that makes sense. But if you start using developer flags for that and put them in a developer grouping, then each developer can have their own preferences on which ones appear first while they're developing stuff, and we don't keep moving menu options around and potentially confusing users, but also putting things at the top of lists that really are only there because developers find them convenient, right? So that's worth thinking about. I'm not a developer, or not a code developer, so I think that's more for them to discuss, but I feel like that would be very convenient. And potentially, if it is convenient, we can add expanded ways where people can come in and manage this list themselves and put their favorite features further up. So then back to our kind of generalized layout. When you come down to a playlist, obviously the playlist that you've chosen will be highlighted, and this context over on the right will change. So the light gray areas at the top and bottom will still remain part of the RetroArch metaphor. So this button is still here. This title will change because you're now in a different area, but it's still RetroArch telling you where you are. And then we're going to add, where relevant, new filtering and sorting options. And then this, because we're in a playlist, green area becomes where the games are, right? And you can see I'm proposing that maybe we have the ability to group games as well, like we did group menu options. And that will potentially help the user in a variety of ways. The other addition is we want to surface cores, right? So we want to make sure that the user is always familiar with our metaphors of playlist, games, cores, and RetroArch. And then where relevant, controls. So a playlist, most playlists, not all playlists, but most playlists have a default core. Particularly if you've done database scans, they'll normally have pulled in a whole bunch of different playlists per platform, and will have a default core or associated core. I think it's relevant to show the user that information because it's reinforcing that they need to be aware of cores and they know what core is, and also that they might want to change it. And obviously for playlists that are a mixture, right, because that's possible, history is one, favorites one, then I think either have nothing here, my preferred option would be, say, something like mixed cores. And so that way, we're still continuing to reinforce the user that there is this concept of cores. And then lower down here, which will become more apparent when we actually look at the mock-up, where a game you've manually specified a different core, maybe because it's more performant or whatever, we should surface that information here as well. It is visible when this sidebar comes out, but when you're scanning through the playlist, that sidebar doesn't come out until you go in. I think it's really relevant to be highlighting that information early to the user because it can act as a bit of a, oh, why is that one different? Did I do that by mistake, or did I change something and that one's not updated? And it allows them to go in and quickly see and fix it without having to click on each game, and then have this thing pop out, right? So it's a matter of convenience. So we can see this in the in this mock-up here. So in this particular example, I've got my playlist on the left, and you can see the new filter bar along the top, and the title for the playlist. So it's reflecting off the title. I'll start on the left-hand side and just talk about a few changes. So one proposed change is to split the playlist name into two, because most of them are what amounts to a manufacturer, so in this case Nintendo, and then a particular console, in this case Game Boy Advance, right? So it could be Microsoft and then DOS or whatever, right? And I think that is just nicer because at the moment Nintendo takes up a lot of screen real estate and then Game Boy Advance gets cut off. And actually most users are probably like, where's my Game Boy Advance playlist, not where's my Nintendo Game Boy Advance playlist, right? Then when we come over here, we've got the same information along the top, right? So it's reinforcing that these two things are connected, Nintendo Game Boy Advance, and then the core that the users either chosen or the database scan chose for them is highlighted here. And as I say, if you were in our history, potentially this says mixed cores. Then below this, we've got filters. So I'm proposing that we expand the search functionality to have searching and filtering, and also the ability to change between lists and grid, which we'll come on to a little bit later. Now, so grouping will determine how these things are grouped. Makes sense, right? Oops. And so, oops, I've gone too far. So in this case, they're grouped by first letter, right? So all the A games are here, all the B games are here. Now, this could be grouped by genre, so it could be horror and shooting and driving, right? You could group by a bunch of different things, publisher potentially if we wanted to. And then filter can have various different ways. So by default, obviously none, so it shows all the games, but you potentially want to choose filter by games I've played, right? Or games that are in progress, or games that I've not started playing. And that would just turn on and off ones based on that. And then we can have sorting. Now the team can come up with loads of combinations, and that should be something that can be added to over time. And so if people have got very particular ways of wanting to organize their content, that these three components would allow that. And then obviously we can have search. Now my suggestion is that by pressing the search and filter button, this bar becomes active, as it were. And so the D-pad left, right, up, down, particularly left, right, context is now driven through here. So you're no longer moving around this, you're moving through this. So you potentially start here and then you know, right, and pressing X, or sorry, the OK button, would then activate these options. And the handy thing about this is it can be used in a lot of different places. We can also use it in cores, as you'll see later on. So then the final of these layout adjustments is what I'm proposing doing to this info area. So at the moment, the info area is a little bit visually detached from the game. And what I mean by that is we don't really highlight this much. And so it's very difficult to realize that the game that you're currently on and these are 100% correlated. It's fairly obvious to most of us, but I suspect for some novice users it's maybe not. And so I feel like it's important to try and strongly reinforce that bond. And then I've also changed some of the order of information here. So I'm proposing adding game name. I don't think that exists at the moment. And then below adding the core. And that's important because we reinforce game and we reinforce core by doing that. And also by reading from top to bottom, you're like, okay, game name is going to use core name, right? And that's what the game looks like. And then we can put the additional information that exists, playtime, etc., below that. So we can see a mock-up of that here. As you can see, what happens when you go into a menu, so if we go back here, the menu is expanded. When you actually press X to go into a menu, this collapses, which I think is good, and I've maintained that. The filtering remains, and then here we've chosen advanced mode, so you can see that we use the same darker color selection, and then we, why is it doing that? And then the background to this area maintains that color as well, so they now feel visually connected. And you can see, what I'd like ideally, I'm not sure if this is possible, is to have this considered a group and then center that group in this vertical space so it sits nicely and also center the text. The other change that I've suggested here is that pressing what was the OK button is now directly the Start button. So you can just come in here, press it, and you'll start the content. And I'm open to discussion. Maybe it's actually the Start button rather than this button. But either way, that brings up the option screen, and that would bring up the menu, which you would normally go into when you used to press the OK button. Because my feeling is most users at the moment just want to come in and play, and by constantly taking them to that settings screen, I think it's reinforcing to particularly novice users that they should be thinking about or worrying about all the other stuff on that screen. And I don't think that's true, right? Ideally, what we want to do is get to a stage where the users set the app up and they're playing games, right? But the more we reinforce that there's all these funky menu options and settings and stuff, the more we create a sort of a little bit of uncertainty in particularly novice users' mind of, is this something I should care about? I keep coming in and seeing this information. Is it important? I've not done anything with it. Is that a bad thing? Should I keep playing about with it? And I think that's potentially where a lot of support issues come from, is that people maybe feel like they need to fiddle with these things and then do fiddle with them and then get themselves a decision that they can't get out of. So anyway, that's my logic between why we should just boot straight into the game and separate out being able to bring up the options. So now there's no more of these volumetric mockups. Now we're just getting into some additional proposals. So when you're in a game, you can bring up the quick menu. Now the quick menu is an interesting one because in the quick menu, you kind of have access to the whole rest of RetroArch. So you can just keep pressing back, and you'll get back out, to one of these screens. You can go as far back out as that. And part of it's because you want to be able to let the user get up to this RetroArch area to keep changing RetroArch settings, right? What I'm proposing is stopping that. And that sounds a little bit harsh to begin with, but bear with me. So what I've done is I've put the RetroArch setting in here. Now, there's a couple of different ways we can do this, but this is the easiest one and maybe least contentious, in inverted commas. And so my proposal is when the user brings up the quick menu, they get brought here. They can't back out in the RetroArch menu system any further than this screen. This is as high level as they can go while the game's running via the quick menu. So if they want to get further, they just close content and then they'll get back, to the usual fun and games, right? But this way, you can only change stuff relating to the game you're in, and you can't get lost. Because I don't know about anyone else, but sometimes I'll back out, go and change a RetroArch setting, and it'll be like, which game's playing? Because if you press the quick menu again, you go back to the game, and then you press the quick menu again, you go back to where you were in the menu, not back here. And so it's quite easy, in my opinion, for the user to get lost and then not be able to easily close the content, etc. So I think by hard locking them to only being able to get up as far as this, worst case scenario is they're deep in a menu and then they just go back, and they get here, right? And they can't back any further. But if they do want to change the RetroArch settings, for example, they click on this menu option, RetroArch settings, and that will open all the normal RetroArch settings as if they'd gone up to the top left-hand menu. But when they back, they will eventually back out of it and come here, is the proposal. I'm hoping that makes sense. What I've also done is I've surfaced some other content here, and I think the users are probably going to want to use a lot, and then push down a level a bunch of content that I feel like users don't want to use a lot, or maybe aren't using a lot. So resume and restart and close content, I think, are fairly obvious. They're there already. Save state, I feel like most users are potentially just saving in the same overwriting a state. And load state is the same. They maybe just want to load the current state. Achievements, I think, are fairly sensible, see at a high level. And then everything else that was there, so actually being able to go in deeper into which save slot you're in and choosing a particular one, that's in game-related settings. All the control stuff's there, on-screen overlays, etc., they are all in game-related settings. My feeling is most users probably don't care about them. Having them sitting at a high level makes them feel like maybe they should care about them. And this way, when you come to the quick menu, we're reinforcing these are the things we really think you should care about, and then game-related settings, core-related settings, and RetroArch settings. If you really care about them, they're here, but we're not talking about them in great detail, right? And then below that off-screen, and potentially we can rearrange this, but below that off-screen is the social stuff of like taking a screenshot and streaming. And that's, I feel, I'm not actually sure how much they're used, and we obviously don't have metrics, but potentially they're not something that a core novice user really cares about. And if you do care about it, you're on Zoom, you just push up and then the bottom 3 or 4 options, right? Cool. This is part of the onboarding of the screen, but I'm surfacing it here because I want to talk about how we can modify choosing cores. At the moment, as we saw in the user journeys, setting up RetroArch is quite an in-depth process. And one of the points at which I think is a little bit of sandpaper-like friction is when you come to choose cores. Because there are, depending on what platform you're trying to emulate, there are a few red herrings here or there. So, for example, even in RetroArch, if you press, I think it's the option button, on some of the cores for Nintendo 64, for example, it basically says, you know, like, don't install this one. It doesn't quite say it like that, but essentially it's like, you know, this is not the best core to use, for want of a better word, or kind of probably words it more like novice users shouldn't start here kind of thing, right? And my feeling is that if we start to add flags to all of the cores, and we can add a whole bunch of flags, such as, you know, runs the majority of all the titles on the platform, for example, or works really well on mobile, you know, etc., then we can use them for grouping and sorting, right? And particularly when, for a new user, I think it's important to help them really get rid of cores that are not going to be good and or useful to them quite quickly. So the proposal here is, as I've just said, is using the flags to be able to group and filter and sort them. And then potentially, the first time they come to this screen, out with onboarding, we don't show them any cores. And we put some text on the screen that says, please press search and filter button to search and filter to enable you to choose cores. Now, the reason that I'm suggesting that is that the RetroArch team, from what I gather, don't or find it contentious or think it would be too contentious to have like a default filter and sorting that shows you know, beginner cores, as it were. Like, you can't really go wrong with these. And also, my feeling is, just by displaying the entire list of cores, it's potential that novice users will never know to use the filter and grouping. So we're in this is one of those tricky ones where if we show no cores, we force them to have to learn filter and sorting, but potentially people are like, there's nothing here, right? So that's one potential outcome. And if we show them all the cores, it's almost guaranteed that no one will realize they can sort and filter them, and then we're at the same problem that we're at the moment, where people are choosing the wrong cores, as it were, and then we get loads of like, my N64 games don't run. Three, we choose a default, right, which is going to satisfy the low-hanging fruit, and it's enough friction that experts and developers are like, I don't like the way this is filtered, how do I change it? And then press a button. So my feeling is all of them have contentious issues. I think the team's going to have to pick one that's the least contentious, and they're going to have to decide on which user group to best kind of serve, as it were. Because I do realize that if, you know, politically, if they pick up grouping and filtering that doesn't show all the cores by default, there will be some core developers who are a little bit miffed. Generally speaking, my proposal would be you should show one core for every single machine that can be emulated, but not more than one. So, for example, Oberon Risk only seems to have one emulator. You should totally show that. I have no idea whether that's an amazing emulator or half broken or what, right? But we should show it because it's the only one. But when it comes to something like N64 or SNES, there's loads of them, right? And I don't know how many are still maintained. I don't know how many are completely performant. But what I do know is some of them are red herrings. And my suggestion would be is best case scenario, RetroArch shows the list to all users when they first come, that's actually meaningful and grouped, and it's just one for each one. But people can still go and group and sort and show all of them should they want to. Anyway, that's the ins and outs of that one. I think this will be a really beneficial feature, even if all we add is just the grouping and sorting and filtering. But if we can go a stage further and kind of either pre-filter it or show nothing and tell the user to filter it, I think they will be really good additions. Also proposing adding a gridded view. I know from the Discord that there's a lot of people, particularly on the developer side, who really don't like gridded views, and that's fine, right? I'm not trying to tell anyone they should have to use a gridded view or that they should like a gridded view, but obviously there's probably a good number of people in the world that do like gridded views, seeing as like Netflix, for example, only uses gridded view, right? So my suggestion would be we should support both, and then users can have it how they want, right? So people who really love lists, they can have lists, and users who really love grids or a visual way of thinking, they can have that. I would personally go with a grid, but I can completely understand why some people prefer a list. And so as you can see up in the filter bar, we've got the two toggleable options, list and grid, and obviously they would switch between the two. My suggestion would be to default it to gridded for new users, particularly if we know we have thumbnails, because I feel like most new users would actually get the most benefit out of gridded, particularly novices, and anyone who doesn't like a grid is going to look at it immediately and go, oh my god, how do I change that? And then bonus, they get educated on how to use the filter and grouping system, right? Some other minor additions here, or just things to note, is it's hard for me to mock up in Figma without going crazy. One, I would suggest playing about with the brightness levels for the selected game versus the non-selected. So potentially the selected game is at 110 or 120% brightness or clarity, or one of those type of color things that makes it stand out more, and the other ones are just 100% or 90 or 95%, so there's just a little bit of difference. And potentially also make the currently selected one slightly scaled up, so it pops out. That was trying to get all of this grid and stuff. I can mock up, but it was just out with time constraints. And then a nice to have is drop shadows always look good, particularly on box art and three-dimensional shapes. Cool. So then I've gone ahead and proposed an onboarding system. So the reason I think RetroArch could benefit from this is I don't think experts need it, I don't think developers need it, but I certainly think that a lot of support requests potentially come from the fact that people haven't set up everything they need to set up to get RetroArch working. Either they didn't realize they need to download a core and couldn't find it because it's hidden away in Online Updater, or they haven't properly scanned for content. So this is a short onboarding system, but I think would potentially get a lot more users using it a lot more quickly. So the proposal is, first time you boot, if it doesn't already detect that RetroArch's set up, right, it would go through this. And this is the first screen you would see. So there's two options, right? Choose cores or exit onboarding. If you're like, I know what I'm doing, then you just go exit onboarding and it will set itself up for defaults, and then you've got to go around and do what you would normally do to set up RetroArch, right? But my feeling is that, one, we want to educate users on what cores, games, etc. are. So let's start there, right? Most users have come to RetroArch because they're like, I want to play a PlayStation 1 game, or I want to emulate Oberon Risk, right? And so I feel like they're going to know what platform they are trying to get games or content running for, right? And we put a little bit of an explanation there cores allow you to play or run games on other content. Before you add games or other content, please choose which cores you'd like to run them on, right? We can talk about platforms in there if we really want, but I think that should give the user a pretty good idea what's actually happening. And then the next screen, which will look familiar because you've already seen it, would take them to, ideally, a pre-filtered list with one emulator per platform, grouped by manufacturer, as it were, and filtered by, for want of a better description, start here, as in, if you use these cores, 99.9% of the stuff you're likely to throw it will work, and you'll be fine. And then, if you want to fiddle about it, you can go find other ones. And so the good thing about this is, firstly, the user's going to come on and go, oh, right, I can see this list. It's got Nintendo, it's got PlayStation, it's got Windows, etc., etc. It's organized alphabetically. Cool, I want to emulate Nintendo 3DS. Down, 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 found it. There's only one on the list. Press button. Okay, done. Right? I propose, and so then when the user carries on from here, we then summarize how many cores they actually added. And this just acts as a double confirmation so that they actually know that they added cores and not, just moved on. 0 cores added. And we maybe want to do a catch here that if it is 0, we maybe want to say, hey, 0 cores are added. Do you want to add cores? And put that as an option here, right? Maybe we want to have some catches, ways of catching the user just in case they make a mistake. Anyway, as long as they've installed more than 1 core, we should definitely say that. And then we're telling them about games and content. And what we're doing here is we're telling them that they're going to be creating playlists. So we're not telling them it's a playlist to begin with, because I feel like that's maybe a little bit confusing. But that's essentially what's going to happen, right? And again, if a user is like, oh, I know what I'm doing here. It's great that I chose cores, but I don't really need to be handheld to add content. They can exit onboarding here if they want to. And by doing that, they now have all the cores that they chose still installed, and then they can go and spend time adding playlists and scanning content however they normally want to do it out with this. So then you get taken to a database scan. It's just you're not even going to get a choice. It's just going to do a database scan, but you have to obviously tell it where. My suggestion is we should try and default. At the moment, I think it defaults to like the root of your C drive or above there, and so you have to choose C, D, E, F. I don't know how it works on other computers. I'm mainly running this on Windows. I'm not sure that's the best place. It's not the worst place, but it's definitely, I'm wondering whether starting in the RetroArch folder might be a better place to start. And even adding in a ROMs or games folder and a content folder there and starting in there might be good. And that way you're kind of then encouraging users to put all the games inside those folders. Anyway, however that works out, once they've come to their particular folder, they can click scan here, and then that will run the scan. Now, obviously, they can scan higher and do all the subfolders, and it will, if they've got ROMs for loads of different platforms and subfolders, it will find all of them, or they can just choose to start in, as it shows here, C Games Bandai WonderSwan, and then that's just going to be presumably the user's WonderSwan games, right? At the end of this, once it's done the scan, I think it would be really important, and it should do this even when you do playlist scans elsewhere in the UI, take you to the screen, because at the moment when you finish scanning, it's very confusing. So I feel like you should start a scan, browse, 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 does the scan, and then takes you here, and then you can just back out or exit. This screen summarizes what just happened to the user. So we should keep account of how many files it scanned over. We should keep account of how many games and or pieces of content ended up being added out of everything that we scanned. And we should keep a list and show them of how many playlists were created. This is important because, say the user knows they've got 50 files in a directory and is under the impression that all of them are going to work, but only 35 get pulled up, then it's really helpful for them to know now that there's 15 games, as it were, that are, for some reason haven't been found. And then they can decide what they want to do with that, rather than assuming it's happened, go into the playlist and then be like, a week later potentially, and be like, oh, why are those games missing here? I don't understand. Something changed. And then if the user wants to scan per folder, right? Maybe they've got WonderSwan and they've got SNES as a separate folder, they can do that here. If they've chosen a high folder and it's done everything below it, and they're happy with the result, then they can just exit, right? So that's up to them. So they can keep adding content and they'll keep coming back here until they've decided that they're done adding content. And then that'll just take them, once they exit, that's them done set up, right? That's them taken to the main menu. Now, there's things that won't have happened. So they won't have updated RetroArch, they won't have necessarily set screen resolutions, etc., etc. I feel like those are things that the user can kind of maybe figure out if they need to. If we really need to make sure that they've done an update, then I would suggest putting that as the first screen. Before we do anything else, let's run an update, right? And then it can just run an update. It's a weird setup in some ways, I get it. It's a bit of a weird setup that RetroArch has there, and I don't know how much the user should or shouldn't care, particularly if they've downloaded the latest RetroArch. I'm not sure how much they actually need to update in the first place. Cool. Then we're on to some additional proposals now. One of those would be ways of grouping and filtering. We obviously added grouping and filtering for list views. This is a proposal on how to group and filter content in gridded views. Obviously, you can see there, depending on how it is grouped, you can get a lot of empty space. My suggestion would be that we find additional ways to group things, not just everything by first letter. But I think this is an interesting view in that it's kind of a hybrid of a list view and a gridded view. So it's potentially, I'd be interested to know if the people who love lists find this view slightly more usable than just the whole smorgasbord grid of everything that the previous gridded view was. Anyway, I think the good thing about things like this is the flexibility it gives users, right? So if you don't group in either list view or gridded view, in list view it's just a list, no groups, and in gridded view it's just a big grid. And then in both list and gridded view, if you group, then things are more spaced out and organized, maybe in a way that makes sense to you, right? And I think that these sorts of bits of functionality can be very useful because, while me personally maybe wouldn't use this view, I can see how another user would and find it useful. And particularly you add things like genres, I can see how this gridded by horror, driving, shooting, platforming, adventure, etc. could actually potentially be quite useful. Cool. This is another way of doing the same grid, view, but instead of the groups taking up a lot of horizontal space, I've made the group titles vertical. So you've got very minimal space separating them. There's a bunch of things that are maybe not ideal about this, that are programmatically as much as anything, in that one, the title has less space to exist, so it has to be concatenated or scrolled or both. And two, you've got to rotate the text perpendicular. Don't know if RetroArch can do that. And three, some users will be like, I can't read that because the text is horizontal, vertical rather than horizontal. So anyway, it was a what if style thought bubble from me, so I thought I'd present it anyway. It does kind of give you a best of both worlds of both gridded and gridded grouped. So it could be quite useful. And that, oh, what's happened here? Oh, that's the end. My mouse stopped working. Keyboard stopped working. Yeah, so that is all of the proposals that I have made to date. I hope they make sense. Obviously, from here, I think working with the team, on how to implement them and those sorts of questions and the information that the developers need to be able to do that, or Nick, you need to go into more detail here and need more diagrams. All of these would be great things to give back to me, or obviously I can stop here. But if it's like we want to develop this, but need more information, then that's definitely something I can kind of take to the next level with the team as well. I do have another mock-up that I'm working on that I might try and present as like a chapter 5. But for where we've got to with this part, it's kind of a good end cap of we've been through the whole journey of who are our personas, what are the metaphors that the app has, and what sort of user journeys and problems is the current user interface facing. And then here are some suggestions that will maybe start to reduce some of that friction and make it easier for novice users to use. So hopefully people have found this helpful. I'm not expecting all of this necessarily to be implemented. Obviously, it'd be great if we can try all or some of it. And yeah, I'm really excited to see where the team go with even just this education process, right? I think having opened people's eyes, the conversations that will start to happen now, even if these particular individual changes aren't directly used, I think will be really good for the team. So thanks everyone for listening. As always, put comments onto the slide deck if you have them, or come into the RetroArch Discord and hit me up with questions, comments, and preferably constructive feedback rather than just destructive feedback would be nice. Thanks.